Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Chances for a Ukrainian victory are looking much dimmer on the battlefield as the U.S. military aid dwindles. At the same time, the Europeans are struggling to figure out a way forward until the latest U.S. aid package arrives. Are we at a tipping point in the proxy war between Russia and the West? Will the U.S. abandon Ukraine just as it did Afghanistan? And as NATO further expands with Sweden's membership, are we seeing more peace on the European continent or more confrontation, which could go beyond Ukraine? Join us for our discussion live today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Mark Sleboda, Moscow-based international affairs and security analyst, Professor Glenn Diesen from the University of South-Eastern Norway, and Professor Robert Kelly from Pusan National University. Welcome to Dialogue. Robert, I start with you. After following this quite successful attacks on Russia, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky now says, Russian advances have been, quote, halted, and the situation is now, quote, much better. So do you agree with him? Is it much better than when? Than what situation?
I think it's basically grinding into a stalemate. I think the material odds are slowly tilting in Russia's favor because of the question that you mentioned at the start, right? I mean, without substantial Western aid, the Ukrainians are probably going to lose at least the portion of the country east of the Dnipro River. But I do think that it's going to take the Russians some time to get through, right? Both sides have pretty deeply dug in. It's pretty hard, actually, to mount offensive warfare through modern warfare through thick lines of defense that have been heavily reinforced. That's one of the reasons why the Ukrainian offensive failed last year, and I think that's also why the Russians have had to expend enormous resources, particularly in infantry, in order to make the advances that they've had. So unless the Ukrainians really run out of ammunition, which seems like it might be the case in the next 6 months, at least until the European defense industries come online, it looks like the Russians have an opportunity, a window of opportunity in the next few months to make some pretty substantial gains. I do have the feeling that there was a breakthrough that might sort of jolt Western opinion, particularly in the United States. But I do agree broadly that the battlefield is slowly tilting against the Ukrainians at the moment.
Mark, do you think that there's a window of opportunity for Russia probably to advance more in terms of, probably confronting Kyiv?
I really don't think that a window of opportunity properly describes the situation on the battlefield, and certainly stalemate. I mean, we've gone from the Kiev regime is winning to where a stalemate, to even the Western mainstream media has largely come to admit, even if some other people apparently have not, that Russia is decisively winning this conflict now. And the problem is not merely about ammunition, artillery shells, although that is certainly part of the picture. And that is not a situation that is going to change. The U.S. and the European defense industries are not geared up for this type of conflict. They've been fighting wars against counterinsurgency wars against tribal Islam across the greater Islamic world, and spending on high-tech boondoggles like the littoral combat ship and F-35s for the last couple of decades. They are not capable of ramping up their military-industrial complex in anything like the next few years, in anything that will even come close to the amount of artillery shells that Russia is producing. And that is according to the New York Times and the CNN. The only difference between these two publications is that the New York Times says that Russia is outproducing all of NATO together in artillery shell production by 7 times, and CNN says it's merely 3 times. There is no foreseeable future where the West catches up in artillery shell production with Russia. And artillery shell production is just the tip of the iceberg. The U.S., the entirety of NATO is also running out of and unable to sustain the supply of air defense interceptor missiles, for example, to the Kiev regime, or tanks. These are continuing problems. Russia's grinding war of attrition is actually threatening, according to the New York Times, the possibility of cascading collapses along the front line later this year. I think that is exactly what we are going to see. There is still a long, hard slog ahead. And our previous commentator is correct that even with Russia's advantages, that there is offense is still hard in modern warfare like this. But the Kiev regime's hardened defenses, they are failing. The Kiev regime's hardest defenses in Avdiivka, the most substantial, were completely destroyed in a number of weeks at the end.
Let's have a Glenn. Glenn, Mark has said, that Russia is having this upper hand in the battlefields, but at the same time, we do see successful or direct attacks on the Russian target inside Russia by Kyiv. Isn't it right?
Yes, well, that's correct. However, I would agree, though, that this idea that Russia's advance has been halted, I'd just like to say I think that is mistaken to some degree, because what we've seen is Ukraine. They've been sending huge amounts of men and equipment towards the advancing Russians, which has resulted in horrific casualties among the Ukrainians and loss of equipment. But this is something they do to prepare defensive lines in the rear, so they're effectively trading lives for time, and this is a very disastrous approach to some extent, because they can't really afford these losses. And the problem is, of course, that the entire front line is cracking, which is why this huge amount of losses of men is really how one has to measure progress, because this is a war of attrition. So if one attempts to hold on to a little bit of territory at all costs at the expense of manpower and equipment, then this can only speed up the eventual consequences. But of course, last night they attacked Russia inside Russian territory with, I think, between 50 or 60 drones. So quite a huge amount. Some of them also were attacking towards the Rostov nuclear power plant inside Russia, and there's also been increased activity around the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. So there's possibilities that as Ukraine begins to near its collapse, it will perhaps do some more, take more greater risks to cause disruption to Russian logistics, but also, of course, possibly to pull in some of the NATO countries as well. This is, well, so far unclear, but I would have to agree that this seems to be, we seem to be towards the final stages of this war as Ukraine is bridging towards collapse.
Okay, more dangerous. So, of course, let's take a look at the other factors here. One is obviously the U.S. Military aid. The latest is, is about 300 million, which is, of course, relatively small compared to the previous talked about 60 billion package currently blocked by the Republican Congress people. So, Robert, what kind of help does this constitute in terms of aid to Ukraine? 300 million here.
Oh, the 300 million. So, yeah. So, a lot of American assistance has been particular tech weapon systems, right? And artillery, right? As your other guests have mentioned, right? Artillery has really become pretty critical. The United States also provides a great deal of assistance to the Ukrainian economy. This is actually one of the sort of the big sort of unknowns in the American debate on this, where there's this perception of the money is being wasted and whatever, right? But a lot of it is actually going to support the Ukrainian economy, because a lot of Ukrainians are actually fighting, or they're injured, or they're otherwise involved in the war effort. And so a fair amount of it is actually trying to keep Ukraine afloat so it doesn't have hyperinflation and things like that, so its agricultural sector doesn't fall apart. Yeah, I would imagine that it's particularly emergency supplies, right? Artillery and air defense, as your other guests mentioned, and then also supports for the economy.
But Robert, a related question is like, of course, the U.S. has started this election, official election season, with both candidates being, decided here. Trump told visiting Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, if he is elected, not a penny will go to Kyiv. Yeah. What would happen without the U.S. support there?
Yeah, so Ukraine has emerged. I must say I'm rather surprised at this actually, but Ukraine has emerged as sort of this enormous issue in American politics. It really has almost become a domestic issue, right? Usually, U.S. voters don't particularly care very much about foreign policy, but it really has become sort of this polarizing issue, and it's not entirely clear why Trump and the people around him, such as Elon Musk or David Sachs, so desperately want the Russians to win. There's this big sort of internal debate on this. My own sense is that Trump, quite honestly, just feels miffed that Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, didn't give him assistance with the 2020 election. But this is sort of a big unknown, right? Does Trump have some kind of vulnerability or something to Putin? But this is now a big issue, right? I mean, this is sort of a major element of the Republican campaign in the fall. I will say, I mean, as a political scientist myself, I used to work in Ohio, where I'm from, Ohio politics back in the United States. Voters don't normally react to foreign policy, so they don't normally care about that, right? And so I'd be surprised if this issue actually has a lot of resonance in the American election. I'm genuinely surprised that this has become such an issue for Trump and his circle, but they really are running with it. I mean, as you mentioned, right? I mean, it's now quite clear that Trump intends to come in and cut this off completely. And so this is now actually probably the defining foreign policy issue for the election, which I don't think anybody would have said to you a few years ago. I think it's really sort of come out of nowhere because of Trump's particular obsessions, I think.
So, Mark, do you foresee, a U.S. abandonment of Ukraine, as we said, just like they did to the Afghans?
Yeah, the Russian government does not feel that a change of figurehead at the presidential level will substantially affect the course of the U.S. proxy war on Russia in Ukraine. We have seen a previous Trump presidency where he campaigned for whatever reason on improving relations with Russia. He attained power. He hired neocons like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo to run his foreign and security policy. And then relations with Russia proceeded to dovetail down to the worst they had been at that time, even worse than President Obama, the worst they had been since the Cold War. So the U.S. deep state, the blob, the permanent state, the bureaucracy of the intelligence, the military, and the foreign policy elite, they're the ones who run foreign and military policy in the United States. I think most presidents, when they assume office, are probably a little shocked to discover how little power to change U.S. foreign policy that they really have. And the Russian government certainly doesn't believe that this will bring about any change. But regardless, Russia's course is set. And whatever leadership finds itself in power in the U.S. will find itself unable to change the realities on the ground in Ukraine.
So for Russia, it's all the same. So Glenn, obviously, I mean, with the departure of the U.S. Military assistance, obviously the burden of supporting Ukraine will be completely on the shoulders of the Europeans. So are they ready to show up, to shoulder this huge responsibility, or are they able to do that?
Well, the simple answer would be no. But I do agree. I think that the American support is withdrawing, no matter who will sit, who will have the presidency. So it's not just about the public and political opposition to the proxy war against Russia, which is growing. But I would also say that I assume that there will be some weapons sent, but it's not just about political will. It's very well reported that there's a lack of weapons and ammunition to be sent across. And of course, Israel takes priority above Ukraine in terms of supplies for weapons. And then also you have the ones in the United States who dream of a future confrontation with China, so they don't want to exhaust themselves completely. So I think that it's important to recognize both for the Americans and the Europeans that printing money is easy, but weapons must be produced, and the ability to ramp up production capacity hasn't really been addressed in the past 2 years of war. So also, who will man these systems? A key problem for Ukraine is the shortage of men, and you can't just train these quickly and build a new army at the printing presses. So I think irrespective, we're looking at both political will and capabilities. The United States is pulling slowly away from this car crash before it all collapses. Now, how will the Europeans respond? I think we were not uniform. I think they're all pulling in different directions. It appears that, for example, the French would like to seize leadership in Europe as a military power if the US pulls out. So they are now saying they might send troops into Ukraine if they're near Kyiv or Odessa, which is a good indication that they're recognizing that Ukraine is now at the verge of collapse. And meanwhile, the Germans were just caught red-handed in a leak of actually being directly involved in fighting Russia, in terms of not just applying the weapons, the intelligence, but also now referring to men on the ground, mainly Americans, to actually pull the trigger as well. It's quite obvious that this is causing more concern there. So while the French are pushing one direction, we see the Germans are becoming more apprehensive, and then you have countries like Poland where you have different political forces pulling them in each direction. Overall, I think the Europeans don't really have the political will either, and also not the capabilities. They're simply, what are they going to send? Even the French who wants to send an army, they don't really have the troops. They envision their troops being sent to the west and to Odessa as possible tripwires to deter the Russians, but also to free up Ukrainian forces so more Ukrainians can be sent to the front. What this is all based on is a strategy of hope that the Russians will not target the French, which I would argue most certainly they would target them immediately. So I don't see any way the Europeans can replace the Americans in this.
Well, Mark, of course, with the involvement, already, let's say, on the ground, British and the French troops over there. We don't know how many of them, but with the official move of sending troops, like either French or British or German, whatever, to the battlefields, what does it mean to Russia?
Yeah, so I agree with Glenn Diesen that there are probably contingency plans within Europe. A lot of countries probably don't want to admit it at this point, but we've had enough intelligence and signals that when the Kiev regime forces are broken to the point where they're not capable of effective organized resistance to the Russian military and begin moving on Kiev or Odessa, it is very likely that we will see NATO troops placed into Western Ukraine, at least western of the Dnieper, perhaps with some far-fetched intentions of erecting a no-fly zone over areas of the country that the Westback Putsch regime still controls in the country. They have a hope and a prayer that they will believe that because they will be flying under official flags this time, rather than the at least hundreds of NATO military troops that are actively involved in a war against Russia in Ukraine right now. They believe that Russia will refrain from striking them, that they will be indeed human tripwires. They are sadly mistaken. And this mistake is a mistake that will bring us very close to the brink of nuclear war. They will move troops across the border into Odessa and other places, and Russia will, as they have said, immediately prioritize striking them with long-range precision strikes, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and then the real crux moment in this conflict will take place. That may still be another year or 2 or 3 down the road, but I believe that it is inevitable.
Robert, how likely is it that European countries, in particular the big powers like France, that will send troops, ground troops to Ukraine to help Ukraine?
I think that's highly unlikely, because once NATO forces start dying on television, then there's all sorts of questions about Article 5 and NATO being chain ganged into the conflict, and European elites have been signaling for a long time that we don't want to do that. I would be really shocked if the scenario that was just laid out were to actually take place. My sense is if I were to sort of lay out an alternative scenario, which would involve sort of Ukraine slowly being ground down and then Ukraine basically agreeing to some kind of partial division of its territory, ceding some of what it's lost, I think that's far more likely, in part because the West would probably argue to the Ukrainians, look, we can't win this thing. We just don't have the popular support. We don't have the defense industrial capacity. And so you should give up some of your territory in exchange for ending this thing. I think that's more likely than NATO involvement. I mean, that raises substantial escalation risks, including nuclear escalation risks. It brings all kinds of credibility issues about, what if we don't get involved? And like, what if only some of NATO gets involved? I mean, it's just a horrible tangle, and lots of elites have signaled we're not going to do that. I mean, it's possible, right? I mean, war goes in all kinds of different directions. If the Russians really do make a breakthrough, if there is a breakthrough this summer, if the Russians actually manage to sort of like break out this summer, I mean, it could change things, right? But I mean, people have been talking about sort of breakthroughs by one side or the other, for the last year and a half, and there hasn't actually been that much movement. So unless there's some dramatic shift in the next 6 months, I'm actually not convinced that this thing is going to look that different in the fall than it is now. But I mean, summer's campaign season, it's easier to fight because it's warmer. So, maybe.
But French President Macron talked about, we should not allow Russia to win this war.
Right.
But, without U.S. military aid, the Europeans are not up to the job. Okay, if Russia is winning more and more, what will happen to the Europeans?
I agree. And Macron has talked big for a while about European strategic autonomy, but there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of overlap and redundancy, right? There's sort of a desperate need for rationalization of the European defense industry, so different places can make different things, and you don't have all this overlap, and 5 different countries making tanks, and they don't share spare parts. I mean, there are all these kinds of problems, right, which Ukrainians have been dealing with because they're getting all these weapons from all these different places, and spare parts and interchange and interoperability has been a huge problem. So all of that, I would argue, regardless of what Macron says, right, or Prime Minister Sunak, all that will really, I think, inhibit the Europeans' ability to actually play a serious ground role, right? I mean, this is really a problem for NATO in the future, right? People have been saying for a long time the Europeans need to get their act together. Maybe Ukraine will be the spark that finally does that. But I would imagine that a partial Ukrainian cession of some of what it's lost, an agreement of some kind, is a far more likely outcome in the next 9 months than NATO involvement. I mean, the escalation risks are just massive, and I don't think the Russians want that either.
So let's, some related development, of course, with we are seeing NATO further expanded to include Sweden. Glenn, of course, for Sweden and other officials, they would say this makes us, secure, probably more peaceful in terms of mind feeding, whether the country is secure or not. But also others would say that's more confrontation, probably make the confrontation more grave, more serious with Russia. Russia probably feel more threatened. What do you make of that?
Well, throughout the Cold War, we had a belt of neutral states going down from the north to the south. And this was not as a favor to the Soviet Union. This was a way of reducing tensions, because there is a security dilemma. More weapons is not always better. And the objective was to reduce the threats to Russia. Now, obviously, now not just Sweden, but Finland has joined NATO, it changes Scandinavia completely, because Scandinavia was largely not considered to be even a front line. Norway has always been part of NATO, but even them used to have a policy against not putting foreign base on their soil. All of this is now gone. And Sweden's neutrality, it's basically always been an obstacle to, if you wanted to convert Scandinavia into this Nordic front line, which we now see it has been done. Obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine startled a lot of Swedes, which made them change their opinion to abandon this very long tradition of neutrality. But of course, they did not have a referendum. I would also add they never even had an honest debate. Majority opinion always used to be against joining NATO, and after Russia invaded, this debate largely disappeared. Either they were for NATO expansion or they would be Putinists. So this was public opinion shifted towards favoring NATO, and so they were rushed into the bloc. Now, what would be the benefit? I haven't seen anyone in Sweden or Finland suggesting that Russia was about to invade them. So this is, of course, going to spark security concerns in Russia, which they will respond to. And once Russia responds, then I assume that the pro-expansionist will say, well, thank God we joined NATO, because now we have a conflict with Russia. And this is part of the problem of NATO as well. It has a tendency to create the security concerns, which then legitimizes its own existence. Now, the problem with Sweden as well, and Finland, and also the militarization of Norway, is that it converts Scandinavia effectively into a new Ukraine, if you will. That is an American front line in the north. We heard the former NATO Secretary General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen. He said that Sweden's accession meant that now we could convert the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake and even put a blockade on St. Petersburg if we would need to. And we also see increasingly the Americans see Scandinavia as a bridgehead into the Arctic, which is why they want so many bases up in the north. So I think this will have tremendous consequences. If you see NATO attempting to control the three major seas of Russia's on Russia's western borders, the Black Sea, the Baltic, and the Arctic, then obviously Ukraine was key to getting control of the Black Sea, and Scandinavia can become a key piece in trying to make effectively the Baltic Sea a NATO lake, as NATO says, and also making the Arctic more militarized. So I think this can have huge, tremendous consequences. And the fact there's no debate about it really, beyond whether or not you're pro-NATO or pro-Putin, it's obscene. It's a tragedy, I would say, at least for our region.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mark, what's the Russia response? Of course, the military action in Ukraine, or the war in Ukraine, is for the sake of, from national security interests of Russia. But now you are seeing basically expand the NATO. Is this the opposite that Russia gets here?
I think that this was inevitable. I mean, let's face facts. For more than a decade now, almost 2 decades, Finland and Sweden have been de facto members of NATO. They routinely conduct military training and drills with NATO forces. They're already largely equipped with NATO standard weapons. This was used, of course, it exploited a situation to brush aside what had previously been opposed domestic political opinion, but it's quite often obvious that the Finnish and Swedish ruling elites wanted to sit with the cool kids in the NATO club. It certainly hasn't improved the security situation for their country. It's actually made it much, much worse. But I think Glenn Diesen brought up another excellent point about neutral buffer states. We've had both the current and the former NATO Secretary General say that there are no more gray zones, no more gray spaces, i.e. no more neutral states can be allowed. There is a feeling that the European continent must be geopolitically consolidated under the control of the U.S. through NATO right up onto Russia's borders. And this, of course, is part of a pressure cooker strategy that Russia will feel compelled to respond to. They have already reorganized several military districts to put additional tens of thousands of troops on in particular, the Finnish border. And they are also will be allocating large amounts of air defense and electronic warfare assets towards the Kola Peninsula. And very much there is a real threat, again, as Diesen pointed out, of the United States essentially using Finland as a big stationary aircraft carrier to try to project power against Russia in the Arctic, essentially in its own backyard. And that is an explosive situation, and one that I think the United States, lacking any type of icebreaker fleet, will find itself facing extreme imperial overreach.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.